What would I like to see from Bond 25 and beyond? Well, stick around and I'll give you my wish list of my top 5 things that I'd like to see in the Bond franchise, this film, and beyond. And stick around, because Friday was Global James Bond Day, and yours truly celebrated with none other than James Bond himself, George Lazenby. I'll tell you the whole story in just a second. So last week we were talking about Cary Fukunaga. He's the new director for Bond 25, and we speculated on what he might be bringing to Bond 25, and I came up with nothing, because I really didn't know this director, so I wasn't sure. Since then, I sat around and I finally got through the first season of True Detective. It was spectacular. I really enjoyed the hell out of that. So, with that in mind, with the film getting underway, let's talk about what we want from Bond 25, and from the Bond franchise in general going forward. So here's my top 5 list of the things I think the James Bond franchise needs going forward. Number 1, stay classic. Here's where I can completely sympathize with the writers who are tasked with creating a modern James Bond adventure based on a character that's created in the 1950s. Let's put this in perspective. Check out this clip from the original Casino Royale, which first aired in 1954.
What happened, sir? Are you hurt?
Still in one piece, but I wouldn't know how.
You were so lucky to miss. He tried to rob you,
They
sir.
tried to kill me. Well, I'll never catch him now.
This production aired only 1 year after the release of the original Casino Royale novel. This production should give you a good sense of the time frame in which the original James Bond existed.
Aren't you the fellow who was shot?
No, I'm the fellow who was missed.
Or take another example of the difficulty of bringing Bond to modern audiences. If you look at the last decade of James Bond novels written by subsequent authors, of these 5 books, only 1 takes place in the modern world, while the rest found it far more manageable just to set the books in the original time frame of the original Fleming novels. James Bond is a creation of the 50s and 60s, the era of Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant. Bond himself is even described in the novels as looking like Hoagy Carmichael, an American musician who reached peak success in the 1930s and 40s. Needless to say, this was quite a different era. This was a time when getting dressed for dinner meant donning a tuxedo. Therefore, keep James Bond in a world of classic style and luxury. Don't be shy about keeping Bond well dressed even in casual moments. World travel, fine dining, and cocktails are essential to the world of James Bond. This is the thing that separates James Bond from all other action heroes. And how about showing Bond in moments of rest and recreation? I think we're long overdue to see James Bond at the card table or the golf course. Number 2, stay an action film. Now this one goes without saying, so I don't want to harp on this point too much. Not only is it obvious that a good James Bond film has good action, but too much action can also be a bad thing. But having said that, Mission Impossible Fallout had some insane action scenes. It was frantic, heart-pounding action, complemented by brilliant camera work and perfect editing, and most of it achieved by good old-fashioned stunt work. I was literally at the edge of my seat. And yes, I'll just say it, the action in Spectre was lukewarm at best. Check out this scene from the finale of Spectre without the musical score. Therefore, I'm not saying that I expect Daniel Craig to start doing all his own stunts, but the producers should certainly look back on its rich history of groundbreaking stunts and continue to push the envelope with high-octane action, and stay focused on practical stunts versus CGI. Number 3, stay a spy film. Is it just me, or is it frustrating when just as James Bond is starting to show signs of weakness,
See you in hell!
another filmmaker will come along and re-energize the spy genre?
You're fired.
Even parodies of James Bond sometimes look a little more like a James Bond film than Bond does. With James Bond trying to compete with other blockbuster franchises, it's easy to forget sometimes that Bond is more than just a typical action hero. He's also a detective. Therefore, keep James Bond's problem-solving skills on display. Whether he's using his skills and experience to detect an intruder, or using his problem-solving skills and determination to execute an escape, or seducing a beautiful woman in order to extract information. This is what being a gentleman's secret agent is all about. It's also good to remember that James Bond was the original international man of mystery. Spying and espionage happens on the world stage, and not all of secret agent work is exciting stuff. Some of it can look downright boring, but even a boring exchange across a conference table can be nail-biting when you're working with the right script.
Oh, come on. You're just an analyst. What can you possibly know what goes on in this mine?
I know Ramius, General. He's nearly a legend in the submarine community. He's been a maverick his entire career. I actually met him once at an embassy dinner. Have you ever met Captain Ramius, General?
So while James Bond should be 90% Ian Fleming, it might not be a bad idea to throw in just a little flavor of John le Carre, Robert Ludlum, and Tom Clancy. Number 4. Stay consistent. I'm sure I don't need to rub salt in these wounds, but let's get a little perspective on just how real this problem has become. James Bond is now crossing his 6th decade in feature films. Starting in 1962, the Bond franchise was going strong, putting out one film every year. By the 5th film, things were slowing down to a more reasonable pace, putting out one film every 2 years. And for the following 2 decades, that pattern of one James Bond film every other year stayed consistent. In the early 1990s, Bond became mired in legal issues, holding up production for several years. It wasn't until 1995 that James Bond would return to the screen with GoldenEye. For a while, it seemed like we were right back on track, with a new film every other year. It was the 20th James Bond film, Die Another Day, where things started to slow down. Instead of every other year, it would be 3 years until Bond 20. A changing of the guard happened again. This time the filmmakers would completely reboot the series, and 4 years later we saw the release of Casino Royale. With the filmmakers pretty excited about the film's success, they released the sequel, Quantum of Solace, 2 years later. After that, things slowed down again. Without any legal issues holding it up, the next James Bond film, Skyfall, would be released 4 years later, and its follow-up, Spectre, took 3 years to be released. Bond 25 was slated to be another 4-year gap. However, with the change of director comes the change of release date, and Bond 25 was officially moved to 2020. So throughout the decade of the 2010s, only 2 James Bond films were released in total. When you look at the timeline this way, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. In the first 3 decades of Bond, we got a total of 16 Bond films. In the last 3 decades, that number would be cut in half, giving us 8 Bond films in 30 years. So what happened? I don't really even need to speculate because both the filmmakers and Daniel Craig have expressed that completing a James Bond film is very tiring. And I'm certainly not one to argue. However, if you look at other film franchises, the competition is ramping up production and cranking out films, while the James Bond films are slowing down to a crawl. Disney Star Wars franchise is putting out one film every year, to the point where even Disney execs have speculated that they're going too hard and too fast. Marvel is operating like an unstoppable machine, averaging 3 Marvel films every year. Now, I'm not suggesting that James Bond should be competing with Marvel and crank out a conveyor belt of films every year. However, I do believe that there are lessons to be learned, and just maybe, rather than being tired out after each film, well, maybe there's something that Bond can learn and work a little smarter and not harder. Therefore, take a page out of the Marvel playbook. What are they doing that allows them to crank out so much good content? Certainly one lesson to be gleaned from Marvel would be delegation. Bring in creative people whom you can trust to carry your brand forward. Create a guideline of things that are going to happen over the course of a few years and make sure the scripts fall in line and deliver a solid quality story. Recently, a Bond fan suggested to me that Marvel is able to crank out movies so fast and furious because they have a certain formula that they fall back on. To which I answered, James Bond is the king of the formula. James Bond films had a very consistent formula that served them for many, many years. I have to wonder, are the filmmakers a little nervous that falling back on the same formula won't cut it in today's marketplace? Well, check out the reaction from this scene from Skyfall.
How's the arm, sir?
What? Oh, it's fine. It'll get better. All pretty shocking for someone unused to field work.
The warm reception that this familiar scene got illustrates how Bond fans old and new would welcome a classic return to all the things that makes James Bond great. And one more thing to keep in mind. Most films follow what they call a 3-act structure, with the beginning section of the film being dedicated to introducing characters, getting to know their motivations, etc. Well, Bond for many years had the advantage of never needing to bother with the first act because we knew the characters already. So Bond was usually able to jump right into the second act, giving us a lot more time to explore different areas, execute several action set pieces, and tell a complete story. Again, getting back to basics, telling simple stories with our favorite gentleman's secret agent being sent out on a mission for Her Majesty's Secret Service should be enough to satisfy not only James Bond fans, but the film-going public in general. This constant need to go rogue, to explore James Bond's past, and get into family childhood traumas. It's enough to make you wonder if the filmmakers are getting a little nervous that the James Bond formula is not enough to deliver. I'm here to propose that the Bond formula has been enough to carry us through 6 decades of filmmaking. Now, while I'm not opposed to taking chances, and I'm not saying we should crank out the same film time after time after time, but certainly the Bond formula has carried this franchise through 6 decades. And when you take a look at the warm welcome that was given to the return of Moneypenny, the introduction of the new Q, and the return to the classic M's office, it just goes to show how Bond fans are dying to get back to basics. Again, keep it simple and work smarter instead of harder. And number 5, stay Bond. Following some of the things I just said when it comes to consistency, the Bond films have also had a funny habit of trying to imitate what's popular at the time. Whether it's whole genres like blaxploitation, martial arts, or science fiction, or a specific popular film series like the Jason Bourne series, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, or even Marvel's cinematic universe. But the best Bond films are always the ones that stay true to the basic essence of what makes James Bond unique. And I propose that it's not a coincidence that each actor's first Bond film tends to be their best, because the producers take these opportunities to showcase what makes Bond, Bond. When the series kicks off, it's truly the golden age of James Bond. Not only is Dr. No an excellent film, but the first 4 films starring Sean Connery are truly the gold standard. These are the Fab Four. It's not until the series starts to look elsewhere that things really start to get wonky. George Lazenby's first and only attempt at playing James Bond is regarded by most Bond fans as an Ian Fleming-inspired masterpiece, truly one of the best. Timothy Dalton came in strong with a Cold War-inspired tale of true espionage, while his next film has Bond battling the classic 80s action movie villain, the Drug Kingpin, and the film gets mixed results at best. GoldenEye illustrates classic James Bond elements and gives Pierce Brosnan a chance to shine in a classic James Bond adventure. And I don't need to tell you how those films went off the rails. And I think that even the most die-hard Daniel Craig fan will agree that Casino Royale, the film based on the first James Bond novel, is far and away the best of Craig's tenure thus far. Now, you probably noticed I skipped over the films of Roger Moore. Roger may indeed be the exception for the first film rule, but it is clear that once the film stops trying to imitate other popular genres and embraces the classic elements of James Bond, Roger Moore finally hits his first home run with The Spy Who Loved Me. Therefore, keep the James Bond films true to themselves. Once they start trying to be something else, chasing the short-lived trends and fads of today, that's where things go wrong. Keep James Bond classic. Keep James Bond Ian Fleming. Keep James Bond a modern espionage thriller. One of the things that I think Casino Royale did brilliantly was that it took a story where the villain was financing the Cold War operatives. The modern incarnation of Casino Royale had villains who financed terrorism. Same basic concept, different war. So Bond was still able to do battle with the rich and powerful. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't take notice of the competition. Sometimes you need good competition to keep you on your toes and to keep you on top of your game. On the other hand, I don't want James Bond to be Jason Bourne. I don't want James Bond to be Ethan Hunt. I want James Bond to be James Bond. It's not hyperbole and it's not fan service to say there is only one. James Bond is a unique creation. If you keep the James Bond films and the James Bond character faithful to their roots, the fans will always keep coming. And that is my top 5 wish list, the top 5 things I would like to see for Bond 25 and beyond. So there you go. There's my top 5 things that I think we need for Bond 25 and beyond to take our beloved franchise and put it back to the head of the pack as far as spy action films are concerned. Hope you liked it. If you think I'm wrong, if you disagree, if you have other suggestions, please put them in the comments below. But for now, as I promised, Global James Bond Day was this past Friday, and it was spectacular. I've been saying it all along to the people who were there. It's not often that an event that you're looking forward to not only meets, but it surpasses your expectations. And I honestly could not have had a better time. So here's a little bit about what happened. October 5th, 2018 was Global James Bond Day. Yours truly was part of a group that went down to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. The headliner was going to be George Lazenby. And a few of us, a couple of my diehard Bond crew decided to go. And just based on the people that I knew were going to go, I was really excited for this event because this is a chance to really bond with close friends. And honestly, it was so good. So it's Friday morning. It is the crack of dawn. I get in my car. I've got my suitcase packed. I drive down to my good friend Dave Zaritsky's house. Dave Zaritsky, who you know from the Bond Experience. We decided to drive down together. Dave had the excellent idea to do some live casting from our Instagram accounts, which I've never done before. And so I picked up Dave. We set up our cameras. We started driving. And I'm driving, drinking coffee, and Dave is on my right. And we just sat there all day talking, for an hour, at least an hour or so, talking to people. People would throw out questions, and we would throw them back. So just the drive down alone was a lot of fun. We had a really good time. Got to our hotel, met up with our friend Harris. So the three of us got together. We had lunch. Now, we purposely got there a little early because David, as you probably already know, was invited to check out the exhibit. We did some shooting. If his video is not up to par for this episode, I will take the blame for that one because I was his cameraman. I think I was a little too close, a little too something or other. But anyway, so we shot some video from inside the exhibit. After that, we just joined up with the rest of the crew who were arriving. Again, a tremendous group of good friends. We met up. We watched George Lazenby arrived. One of the really fun things about this was that my good friend Anders, he runs a website called From Sweden with Love. It is honestly one of the best Bond sites out there, and he is truly one of the foremost Bond experts. So I knew he was going to come also, and I made sure to, as soon as I realized he was going, I sent him a note and said, make sure we get together afterwards and get to hang out. Yeah, he said, absolutely. I didn't realize that he was now George Lazenby's representation. So if you ever want George Lazenby to speak at one of your events, Anders is the guy to talk to. So that was kind of exciting. And anyway, so we all got together. We all, met in the lobby, said hello. And then we went upstairs. They had drinks. They had hors d'oeuvres. And so then it was time for George to do his Q&A. And of course, George is George. He tells great stories. He speaks so frankly. He's got the funniest stories. If you haven't seen the documentary, the Becoming Bond documentary about George Lazenby, I highly recommend it because it is really a lot of fun. It's truly very well done, and it's funny. It is really funny. I mean, George's stories, his experience is funny enough. When you hear him tell the stories in person, it's just spectacular. So once this portion was over, once the Q&A part was over, we had carte blanche to walk around the actual exhibit. It was the Exquisitely Evil exhibit. This was the exhibit that the International Spy Museum has had for many years now. And again, it's dedicated to the Bond villain. So there's a ton of different Bond props from the films, very cool stuff, and it's really well done. I mean, the design of the exhibit is terrific. So then, in conjunction with being able to check out the exhibit, this is when George came down and would take photos. People did one-on-one photos. I kind of snuck mine, as you saw in the beginning. I kind of ran up, and again, luckily I'm friends with Anders, and he was kind enough to get me to get a picture with George. But Anders was also kind enough to make sure that our whole crew, got to take one picture with George Lazenby. And check this out. I mean, this is a great representation of the evening as a whole. I mean, again, all the guys are dressed like 007. We're hanging out with James Bond himself, George Lazenby. I mean, just look at this photo. I mean, we had so much fun. And honestly, I mean, again, already at this point, I am enjoying the hell out of my experience tonight. Good friends, good atmosphere. I mean, it's just, again, and you know, Bond guys, you don't get a lot of that. Every so often, there's some kind of a Bond gathering, either whether it's a small gathering with friends or, like, you know, a larger official function that many of us will go to. So anyway, this evening is going spectacular. After this part, the bunch of us decided to go across the street to, there was a bar restaurant on the other side where we got a table for dinner, and George Lazenby came with us. So it's a big table full of people, and we're sitting there, and there's George at the head of the table. And again, you can't make this stuff up. George is looking at us saying, like, why am I hanging around with these dudes? There's a table full of girls, beautiful girls, sitting like a few tables over. He gets up, he walks over, and he's single-handedly macking on every girl at this table. So of course, we are just cracking up. I mean, and George is, again, this guy is in his 80s. I mean, he is not a young man. So here he is, like, just hitting on these girls, and of course we're just cracking up. We think this is the funniest thing in the world. So the next morning, Anders, you know, before the night was over, we were talking, and I said, what are you doing for breakfast? And he said, well, we'll probably do breakfast in the hotel. His hotel was two doors down from where I was. So I checked out of my hotel. It was Anders, his friend Bjorn, our good friend Jeff, and George Lazenby just hanging out in the hotel. And the five of us went to breakfast. I'm sitting, literally, George is sitting to my right, I'm sitting here, and Anders and Bjorn are sitting right across, and I'm sitting there going, and of course, we're just eating breakfast and talking now. And he's talking about world politics, and I mean, it was sort of across the board of the things that were discussed. So again, this is awesome. I'm having a great time with this. And then breakfast was done. They're getting ready to pack up, and they have to head to the airport. Anders had to take a walk down to the Spy Museum again to pick up a few things that the museum had given George to give to his children, or grandchildren. And so anyway, and I was headed back down to my hotel anyway, so I took the walk too, and it ended up being just the four of us. At one point, Anders and Bjorn walk ahead, and it's literally me and George Lazenby walking down the street, and we just started chatting. And again, just sort of, it's amazing how you just kind of, it wasn't long. It was just a block or two that we're talking, and we ended up just talking about just life and how things change and move on and everything. And I'm sitting there going, like, this is crazy. I said, it's me and George Lazenby just walking down the street chit chatting. And it was, I mean, again, I'm sure, like, for a guy like Anders or for other people, this is like, you know, done that already. Me, I've never had this experience. I met George Lazenby one time at a signing years ago, and it was like I was kind of a deer in the headlights, so I barely said anything. I had him sign a couple things. Oh, I love the movie and everything, you know. But that was it. Here I am, kind of just literally we're walking down the street in Washington D.C. just having a conversation, and I honestly just could not have. It was a dream come true, honestly. And I'm not the type to get, like, kind of starry-eyed when it comes to, like, famous people or whatever. But this is George Lazenby. This is the guy who was he in my favorite Bond movie. He was James Bond, you know, and his real life is at least as fascinating as his on-screen life. So again, it was just a wild experience, you know. I just loved it, and honestly, by the time I was saying goodbye, and I'm hugging Andrew saying goodbye, and can't wait to see you next summer. And when I'm back in my car, I'm just on cloud nine. I mean, this whole weekend was so spectacular. All the guys that I was with, absolutely spectacular. And I'm gonna stop gushing because I know this is probably getting a little long and a little boring. But honestly, I mean, I wanted to sort of talk about this weekend and be able to kind of gush a little bit about, again, what a great experience, what a great crew of guys that I was with. Again, it was just so cool to hang out with this crew, guys who you don't see too often, but you have, I mean, I kind of feel like we overuse the word camaraderie, but I can't think of a better example of camaraderie than this. A bunch of guys who are not only friends, but they're sort of compatriots in that we have this sort of similar passions that we can share and talk about that you don't get to do very often. That's it. That was my global James Bond day. I never really made a big deal out of it before, except for posting a graphic on Instagram. But this was the first time I celebrated it in a way that I will honestly never forget. That's it. That's all I got for you. So this is your good buddy, head of section, Joseph Darlington. Thank you, as always, for watching these videos. And I will be back very soon with another one. So until then, have a great week and just keep on living like James Bond.